Hola, hola, ¿me oís? No. ¿Sí se oye? Que va a haber traducción simultánea. Para ello tenéis que conseguir unos auriculares, que creo que allá al fondo hay, y entrar en el canal de Telegram de Traficantes de Sueños, de la editorial Traficantes de Sueños, y clicar en el streaming. ¿Sí? ¿Se entiende? Sí, ¿no? Bueno, pues vamos a empezar. Bueno, gracias a todas y todos y todes por estar aquí. Bienvenidos. Es un acto organizado por Traficantes de Sueños para la presentación de este libro, Valores familiares entre el neoliberalismo y el nuevo socialconservadurismo. Y contamos con la autora, de Melinda Cooper. La presentación está organizada por Traficantes de Sueños, pero también por Nociones Comunes, porque es una sesión de un curso que comienza, bueno, que está empezando ahora, que se llama Abolir la familia frente al capital, el Estado y el patriarcado. Es un curso que todavía está abierta la inscripción, digo, por si a alguien le interesa, puede entrar en la página de Traficantes de Sueños en Nociones Comunes y bueno, inscribirse. Sin más, bueno, Melinda Cooper, gracias por estar aquí, es profesora de Sociología en la Universidad Nacional Australiana de Canberra y además del libro que presentamos hoy, es autora de otras obras, ¿no? Ahora mismo también trabaja en una teoría política del resurgimiento de la extrema derecha y su relación con la crisis financiera, y también investiga sobre políticas neoliberales y finanzas públicas, ¿no? Tiene varias obras sobre financiarización, economía de activos, ¿no? De asset economy, o contrarrevolución, extravagancia y austeridad en las finanzas públicas. Estos no están traducidos. Y también está investigando, bueno, ha hecho trabajos sobre economía política de la biotecnología y también ha publicado varias obras sobre esa temática, pero que tampoco están traducidas. Sin más, bueno, voy a empezar con la primera pregunta. Los valores de la familia, este libro, demuestra cómo el despegue del neoliberalismo en los Estados Unidos de los años 70 y 80, fue posible a partir de una alianza de los intelectuales neoliberales y del conservadurismo, ¿no? Es, bueno, una alianza que se produce también en otros países. Esta alianza se da también como una reacción a las luchas feministas y de las disidencias sexuales. Ella lo llama como movimientos antinormativos, pero también de los movimientos que luchaban por la ampliación del estado del bienestar. De hecho, esta alianza realmente se produce, ¿no? Este cuestionamiento del estado del bienestar se produce cuando estos dos vectores de luchas confluyen, ¿no? De alguna manera, los conservadores consideran que estas medidas del estado del bienestar han ido demasiado lejos porque, de alguna manera, han acabado financiando formas de asistencia social que, según ellos, contribuyen a la ruptura de la familia, ¿no? De hecho, bueno, ambos, tanto los neoliberales como los conservadores, consideran que la familia es como el eje, ¿no?, que estructura la sociedad y la economía. Pues nada, te quería preguntar si puedes explicar brevemente por qué es importante tener en cuenta hoy esta alianza para entender el funcionamiento tanto del neoliberalismo como de las tesis conservadoras que están resurgiendo en todo el mundo.
I can explain these theses, and I'm just going to step a little backwards, a step backwards, just to explain what the provocation for me was. What was the thesis that I was arguing against? There seemed to me that there was emerging on the left a commonplace idea that feminism and various other movements of the new left had somehow collaborated with neoliberalism in destroying the male breadwinner wage, in destroying the forms of security that had been provided by the Keynesian welfare state. And feminism in particular was the target here because, as one feminist philosopher, Nancy Fraser, argued, there was a kind of subterranean elective affinity between neoliberalism and feminism, second wave feminism. this is what she was arguing anyway, inasmuch as both were intent on undermining the forms of social, economic, and intimate security that had been built into the Keynesian social order, namely the family wage. Now, I took Nancy Fraser as a special target because she's such a powerful and, I think, important thinker, but this idea seemed to me to be everywhere on the left in some form or another, and I thought it was extremely dangerous because if you take it to its logical conclusion, it means that you need to restore social order, gender order, even racial order, national borders, if you want to resist neoliberal capitalism. Okay? So I thought it's really important for us to take a step back to look at what was actually happening in this all-important turning point, the capitalist crisis of the 1970s and 80s, and to figure out what was really going on, what was the relationship between these movements. Obviously, feminism is a critique of gendered and sexual hierarchy. And obviously, it does need to be an attack on the family wage, not so much on its redistributive intentions, but on its conservative gender order. So what was going on there? So I went back to these movements. I focused on one movement in particular, the welfare rights movement, which is less spectacular than the more kind of street-based militant movements such as Black Power, or even the more kind of visible part of second wave feminism. I thought it was an extremely important movement, not only because it seemed to scare the daylights out of the political right at the time, but also because its strategy seemed to be so multifaceted. I began to think it really was a dangerous movement in a good way. This movement, to me, disrupted the idea that neoliberalism can simply be read as responsible for the turn against Keynesianism, okay, as wholly responsible. Because when you look at these movements of the 60s and 70s, these radical left movements, they too were radical challenges to the Keynesian social state. Okay? They attacked the Keynesian gender order. They attacked its internal limits, its internal hierarchies. At the same time, they did not abandon the ambition for a more radical distribution of social wealth. In fact, what they were doing precisely was to say, let's radicalize the distribution of social wealth beyond the limits that are tolerable to the Keynesian state. Okay? So let's push the social wage beyond the limits that are tolerable to the Keynesian consensus. So on the one hand, I think you can agree with Nancy Fraser that yes, this was a radical attack on the male breadwinner wage as a gender order, as a hierarchical gender order. It was certainly not an attack on the social wage. In fact, it was a radicalization of the social wage to a degree that could not be tolerable to a capitalist state. Okay? And the reaction to that was clear-sighted. Okay? I should add that the welfare rights movement can be seen as part of an upsurge in radical left movements that includes also the left of the trade union movement, and it was skewing left in the Anglo-American economies at this time. When I say skewing left, I mean they openly were pushing for wage inflation beyond any kind of idea of shared growth. They were trying to win back more of national income from capitalists. They were trying to erode the profit share of national income. Okay, this was an active strategy of wage push inflation. Radical on the wage level, radical also on the level of who was included. Migrant workers, black workers, young workers, women workers, public sector workers in the US. Okay, this also was a sore point. And much of the energy for the welfare rights movement, for a brief moment, came from the fact that more and more minority workers were employed in public sector welfare agencies. So not always by all means, but sometimes there was collaboration between welfare state workers and welfare state recipients. So you can see that this was an incredibly dangerous moment from the point of view of capitalists who had hitherto been perfectly fine with the Keynesian consensus. And biographically, you see people, corporate leaders, economic thinkers like Milton Friedman, who had been part and parcel of the New Deal Keynesian state, saw its benefits for capitalism, had no problems with it, faced with this heightened militancy, labor and welfare militancy of the 1970s, they decided they wanted to opt out of the Keynesian compact. Okay? So their turn against Keynesianism came after and in reaction to the leftist challenge to Keynesianism. So that is the revision of history I think is very important to make. Otherwise you're eliding what the feminism of this moment was really about, and the other anti-racist and labor movements of this moment. So who are the new players that enter the scene here? It seems to me that it's a class of economists who are explicitly anti-Keynesian, the neoliberal economists, and who want to dismantle the whole apparatus of welfare. If the welfare state is making people too entitled, too empowered, if the welfare state is bizarrely subsidizing people in their revolutionary desires, then let's get rid of the welfare state altogether. On the other side, you have neoconservatives who are genuinely in the conservative tradition and who see the breakdown of family as not just the symptom, but the catalyst of the capitalist crisis of the 1970s. Now, this to us looks like a recognizable conservative diagnosis. What is interesting is that neoliberals at the time were saying something very similar. Okay? It was the attack on the economic structure of the Keynesian family that was the real threat to American capitalism. Why would neoliberals worry about the family? They're not, economic liberals are not supposed to worry about the family. In fact, if you take a longue durée view of economic liberalism, economic liberals have always been obsessed with the family, but that's another argument. They understood that the family had an economic function, okay? And they thought that they could restore capitalist order if by dismantling the welfare state, they pushed people back into forms of kinship of any kind, voluntary, forced, normative, non-normative, that would operate as a substitute for social welfare. So you find that at this moment, neoliberals and neoconservatives find this strange point of convergence where they see the economic crisis as being all about a breakdown of the family and a breakdown of gender order. And they agree that it needs to be restored in some way. It's not going to be the mid-century male breadwinner wage. It's going to be an idea of private family responsibility. You need to fall back on family wealth, and if your family has no wealth, you need to fall back on family networks of unpaid labor, mutual indebtedness, etc. So this was the strange kind of symbiosis I was interested in.
I'm gonna ask something else. ¿Sí? Es muy corta. Has dicho, bueno, que tu interés en esta temática empezó también, bueno, por las críticas de ciertas proposiciones desde la izquierda o ciertos teóricos de izquierda que cuestionaban el feminismo y las luchas de las disidencias sexuales. ¿Quieres traducirlo? Sí. Y bueno, y cómo de alguna manera esa alianza entre las luchas por la ampliación del estado del bienestar y las luchas antinormativas fue lo que, ¿no? Como una respuesta o sea, como que se planteaba esa alianza de los neoliberales y los conservadores a partir de ese frente conjunto de lucha, digamos. Entonces, la pregunta en realidad quiere traer eso al presente y preguntarte si tú crees que esa alianza entre movimientos disidencias sexuales o feministas están empujando los límites del estado del bienestar o están reivindicando ese tipo de cuestiones, también para entender por qué se producen esos cuestionamientos o esa propuesta de crítica a partir del concepto de neoliberalismo progresista, etcétera. No sé si se entiende bien. ¿Tú lo has entendido? Más o menos no. O sea, si crees... No, it's a new one. It's if this alliance between feminism and welfare movements is going on now, or something similar to this. Because I want to ask you if you think there's something true in this critique of the progressive neoliberalism. Because I think this is talking about
A real development.
Well, hegemony inside the democratic party in the state.
Right, yeah. Okay, so there's part of Nancy Fraser's argument against progressive neoliberalism that I agree with. I just don't agree with her definition of progressive neoliberalism. So her argument is more or less is that part of the left was recuperated by and absorbed by neoliberal demands for identity recognition, legal inclusion, the expansion of certain rights, say for sexual and gender minorities and racial minorities, detached from a wider question of social redistribution. Now, and she sees that as going hand in hand with a kind of a frivolous politics of sexual freedom and identity. Now, I see that part of the left was absorbed into, how can I put it? I can see that there were real gains made in the recognition of non-normative relationships. The most obvious example here is same-sex marriage, okay? So you can see that as an example of progressive neoliberalism. But what seems clear to me that is going on here is that the radical impulse of these 1970s movements has at the same time been channeled back into the form of the kinship relation, back into the form of marriage and family. There's a reason for this that is economic and that is entirely compatible with neoliberal ideas about the welfare function of the family. And when you look at the jurisprudence around same-sex marriage, the argument was that we should let gays get married because the spousal unit will serve as a substitute for welfare. Gays being married mean that they are no longer a burden on the state. The argument was forged at the height of the AIDS crisis when public authorities found that they were responsible for the emergency hospital costs of people dying with AIDS. Neoliberal economists such as Richard Posner were the first to recommend same-sex marriage because he saw, for one, he was neoliberal, he had no kind of moral antipathy to non-normative sexuality. But at the same time, he thought that rights to non-normative sexuality should only be recognized on the proviso that people enter some kind of legally enforceable family relationship. This happens in welfare too, and this occurs under the Clinton administration, which Fraser sees as the kind of apogee of progressive neoliberalism. This is a welfare reform that revives and federalizes the most atavistic, punitive forms of welfare discipline in the pre-New Deal southern United States. And it's the principle of this welfare reform is that a woman on welfare should be dependent on a spouse, on marriage, rather than the state. So what this welfare reform did is redirect welfare money towards tracking down the genetic fathers of single mothers, okay? So Nancy Fraser doesn't take this landmark policy reform of progressive neoliberalism and ask, what does this mean about neoliberalism? It's clear that when it comes to the care of dependents, neoliberalism is not only happy to recognize the family, it will actively invent family relationships that are not emotionally or intimately real or consensual, and enforce the people in these relationships to subsidize each other, to pay for each other's welfare instead of the state. So family responsibility is an absolute pillar of progressive neoliberal ideas. So to sum it up, I do agree that a large part of the left succumbed to neoliberal thinking. I just don't think neoliberal thinking is in any way anti-familial or anti-gender hierarchy. I think it can combine with sexual non-normativity, and that's the paradox of our time. We've seen a widening of the forms of sexual expression and kinship that are allowable, but that doesn't mean that kinship itself is not, one, central to the neoliberal welfare state, and two, actively enforced as a state obligation. This is absolutely central to neoliberal economic thinking.
This one. Bueno, pues en general también vemos como la izquierda, también aquí en el Estado español y en buena parte de Europa, yo creo que está reivindicando también la institución familiar, incluso precisamente, y a pesar de estos análisis se dice que es un bastión de resistencia al neoliberalismo o al capitalismo. Y cada vez yo creo que existe como menos análisis sobre cuál es el papel de la familia como institución que disciplina, ¿no? Donde, por ejemplo, se aprenden los roles de género, o de un análisis más profundo de cómo contribuye al sostenimiento, pues eso, tanto del patriarcado como del propio sistema económico, ¿no? Creo, y no sé, supongo que estaréis de acuerdo conmigo, que el feminismo tampoco está haciendo, o que ha perdido, digamos, esa crítica o ese cuestionamiento a la familia que sí estaba muy presente en los años 60 y 70. Y bueno, ella ha comentado un poco, ¿no?, como estas demandas del matrimonio homosexual también, bueno, como qué función tuvieron o qué función han tenido, y que yo creo que también en los movimientos LGTBI pues la demanda del matrimonio homosexual también ha descentralizado esta digamos, crítica más profunda de la familia, ¿no? ¿Por qué se ha producido esto? ¿Y por qué crees que es necesario cuestionarnos, analizar o desafiar la institución familiar?
Did you add something at the end? Oh, does it matter?
Maybe it's here. No.
Okay, this is the end.
Yeah, I think there's something missed.
Why was this produced? Is the last question she said.
Okay, why did this happen? Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea that the family is a bastion of resistance to capitalism, I think, is the kind of last mythology of both the left and economic liberals. If you look at the history of economic liberalism, they've always been quite embarrassed about the role of the family in their vision of economic dynamics. I mean, because really they're always foregrounding the individual. They're always foregrounding personal responsibility. And the contradiction there is that you see the contradiction most clearly around the question of inheritance. Economic liberals have always struggled with that, you know, since the French Revolution, because inheritance, or certain forms of inheritance, primogeniture and entail, look like the ultimate bulwark of the feudal aristocratic order. And yet, economic liberals are hardly going to do away with inheritance. They need it, and yet they see that there's something rhetorically contradictory there, because on the surface, they're always talking about meritocracy, they're always presuming a formal egalitarianism in the economic contract. But as soon as you have inheritance, you have to admit that two individuals do not come to the labor contract as equals. Okay? So the family is always this stumbling block. And economic liberals will always kind of be talking about the family in the footnotes or on the side or as a disclaimer. And yet it is absolutely fundamental, because to protect private wealth, you need to protect the transmission of wealth within the family. So the family has never been a form of resistance to capitalism. It's the form in which private wealth reproduces itself across time. This is not to say that the form of the family remains static. Okay? It changes dramatically at different times. This is not to say that it has the same function for different classes. Okay? But it is absolutely essential. I'm just wondering what to add to that. I'm sorry, was this question again?
Why is necessary to question the family institution? What's the last one?
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess following on from that, it becomes clear why resistance to the family is also fundamental to anti-capitalism. I mean, you cannot critique or confront capitalism in any serious way without looking at the institution of inheritance and without wanting to do away with the reproduction of private wealth across time. Interestingly, this is something that Marx was quite ambivalent about. We tend to think of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels called for the abolition of inheritance. But several decades later, this was the major dispute between Marx and Bakunin. Bakunin was then calling for the abolition of inheritance, and the anarchist feminists in his circle were doing the same thing, but with a much more sensitive, gender-based critique of the role of the family. They saw it also as a kind of organizer of sexual morality and of patriarchy. It was, if you look at their texts, they're very interesting because they're looking at how the economic structure of family wealth, the structure of unpaid labor in the household, creates this dividing line within women between alienable and inalienable property. So woman and mother, so at its most kind of caricatural, the Madonna and whore. So there are economic bases to this fantasy. The feminist critique of inheritance in communist and anarchist circles went much further than Marx and Engels. And it implied that the critique of family had to be extended to the proletarian family also. Now, Marx spent quite a bit of time sympathizing with movements that wanted to drive women out of the factories and restore a proletarian family order. So while he could critique the institution of inheritance in the bourgeois family, he was never willing to critique the proletarian family. And that for him was a kind of, he, like many on the left, saw the proletarian family as the bulwark against capitalism. Okay, so that was Marx's limit, at least before his posthumous Origins of the Family, where I think he becomes more feminist. What I'm trying to say is that resistance to the family is necessary to both feminism and to anti-capitalism. You can't have a comprehensive critique of capitalism if you don't attack its primary means, the primary means by which private wealth is reproduced. It's as simple as that. And that's inheritance, family.
Siempre dices que no existe algo así como la familia tradicional, sino que esta figura es una producción histórica. ¿A qué te refieres?
Yes, so when people defend the family, they're always looking back 30, 40 years to what the family used to be. And if you take a historical view of this, it's quite funny because that traditional family, the real family, was always 30, 40 years ago for everyone. Something that bugged me when I wrote Family Values is the way almost always it was reviewed. People, even sympathetic to the argument, rejigged it a little. And they said, this is a critique of the normative patriarchal nuclear family. It is that, but it's also a critique of the family. I'm sorry. Sorry. It's a critique of the non-normative family too. It's also a critique of the extended family. People seem to think if only families were extended, they would be much better. That's a very funny move to make, I think, right now, because I think if you look at 20th century family formation, the nuclear family was a byproduct of the Fordist family wage. The ability of a family unit to live together in a single housing unit without extended family and without domestic servants, when you're talking about the middle class, that is a symptom of the Fordist family wage. A mother's unpaid labor was partially subsidized by the state, replacing domestic service in the middle class. There are enough welfare supports that the proletarian workers could afford a single family unit. All of these kind of welfare supports created an individualized family, oddly enough. Today, I think we are very clearly, in many countries, moving back to an extended family form. So I take the example of Australia because I think it's most clear, because there is no migrant system of domestic care work. So what is happening is that married women or women with children continue to work, but it's extended family who look after children. Increasingly, the inflation of house prices means that people are living together more and more in multi-generational households. Children are living in family homes into their late 20s, 30s, even beyond. Grandparents are living there. Okay? In the best case, that is a sharing of family wealth. In the worst scenario, it's a sharing of family debt. Okay? And in Australia, this return to the extended family is very visible because this is a country when I was growing up, people left home at 16 and lived independently. That was the norm. So this has changed in 20, 30 years. I do think the neoliberal trend is toward the extended family. This is why I have no romanticism for traditional families, and I think we need to be very skeptical when people evoke these ideas or romanticize them.
Sorry, I'm going to jump again because this is a question we ask in the course. This is a part of a course, and we are asking this
How do we make
Sí,
launch in that?
la pregunta era, pues, con esta respuesta que ha dado, ¿qué debería hacer el Estado con la familia? O sea, si queremos establecer vínculos más libres entre las personas o generar otro tipo de familias, por así decir, no genéticas o vínculos libremente elegidos, ¿cuál debería ser el papel del Estado, digamos, o no, o qué no debería hacer el Estado en relación a posibilitar que esos vínculos entre las personas sean de una manera más libre?
Well, I think people are already making non-genetic families. So the most obvious example there is IVF and assisted reproductive medicine. But it becomes very clear in those arrangements that it's the legal ties of kinship that matter. And a legal kinship relationship can completely override a bodily kinship relationship, depending on the laws in place. We see that with surrogate mothers. Okay? A lot of legal work is done to exclude them from the commissioning family. If you're thinking about, say, chosen and queer families, I think people create forms of relationality all the time. I think they become legal family when they become enforceable by the state. Now, you might not choose to do that. This is the interesting point, and I don't think people are fully aware of that. So, same-sex marriage is one instance where, say, a non-normative couple can enter into a legal relationship consensually. But there are multiple examples of cases where the state, again, the neoliberal welfare state, identifies and creates those relationships and enforces them, even when the parties involved do not agree that they're in that relationship. An example, the system of income support in Australia employs spies who go to share houses where people are suspected of welfare fraud and spy on them, take photos, video them, look at their mail, and they make decisions about, they make a case that, say, these two people are in a sexual relationship. Okay? And once they've decided that, or they're in an intimate partner relationship, once they've decided that, you're on a spousal support. That spousal support implies that you are mutually dependent on each other. You have a family responsibility. Okay? So your individual welfare benefit is cut. Okay? So the Australian unemployment system was the first government agency to recognise same-sex relationships long before they were legalised. So to me, the question of making non-genetic families or non-genetic kinship or non-normative kinship is not something I see as a liberating horizon. I think sometimes the language of kinship is used in a very loose way. But kinship means care obligation. And as soon as the state sees it or registers it, it becomes potentially enforceable.
En una obra que tienes que se llama The Asset Economy, que has escrito junto con Lisa Atkins y Martin Konings, explicáis cómo desde los años 80 hemos entrado en una fase de bienestar basado en activos, que es un concepto similar al que utilizan Isidro López y Manuel Rodríguez en su libro Fin de ciclo, que también está publicado por Traficantes de Sueños. Ellos hablan de una sociedad de propietarios y, de alguna manera, yo creo que vuestro trabajo en concreto sirve perfectamente para explicar la realidad española, ¿no?, donde la financiarización, sobre todo de la vivienda, se ha convertido en un sustituto del estado del bienestar, ¿no? Y hoy las posibilidades de vida están más definidas por la propiedad que se posee, ¿no?, los activos financieros, pero también inmobiliarios, es decir, por el patrimonio familiar que se hereda, más que por los salarios que se pueden obtener en la mayor parte de trabajos o de actividades profesionales. Bueno, de hecho, antes estaba viendo una encuesta del País que decía que los mayores de 60 años en España, casi el 40% en el último año, I will translate, en el último año habían ayudado a sus hijos a pagar el alquiler o a pagar la comida, la electricidad, etcétera, ¿no? Eso, casi el 40% de los mayores de 60, es decir, que estaban ayudando a sus hijos, pero a sus hijos incluso ya bastante mayores, ¿no? Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿qué consecuencias tiene esto para la configuración de las clases sociales hoy o para la movilidad social, pero también para la familia, ¿no?, en tanto institución que acumula y transmite ese patrimonio? In Spain, that was recent today.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It's a lot.
That's a really interesting example because I want to stress that family responsibility works in both directions, from children to parents as well.
This was parents to children, but it was
okay.
over 60. Then it's people very
Oh, they
old
still.
also, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. So yeah, home ownership in places like Spain, the US, the UK, Australia. This is something that third way, so-called progressive neoliberals jumped on because they thought, okay, if we're going to elevate family wealth, we can develop a kind of middle-class policy out of this because home ownership is so widely dispersed, relatively widely dispersed. If we can push as many people into home ownership as possible and support the value of houses and actually inflate the value of houses, then we will draw this whole constituency into the economy of family wealth transmission. Often the argument was that we will create a generation of little conservatives too, like people who want to protect their property, their family wealth. And I think in many ways that was quite a successful proposition. This went together with deliberate efforts to inflate the value of assets in general, but but also of homes, because homes became financial assets for the middle class. The problem here was that at a certain point, you could no longer keep including people in this economy because house prices get so high and levels of debt become so extreme that there's a whole generation of people who will never be able to enter this treadmill, okay? So I think we've long gone past that moment where there was a kind of aspirational neoliberalism, and we're starting to see the dividing lines again. There are people who own property, or parents own property, people who will inherit even later in life, and there are people who will never inherit, who are stuck in renting and precarious labor. This utterly transforms the way in which class is organized. If you think of two people in relatively well-paid professional jobs, but in a very expensive city in terms of property prices, they are actually in two completely different class positions. Okay? Because one does not have to worry about housing costs. They do not have to worry often about consumer credit, because housing is collateral. Okay, so in this book that I published with two colleagues, we tried to set up a kind of alternative typology of class that took account of people's positions with respect to financial assets, including housing. Now, at the very top are people who own and deal in financial assets that are non-residential. Okay, so it will be private equity, it will be intellectual property, stocks. But there's a big kind of upper middle where it's housing. Okay? And then, so there are people in that class. There are people in that class who also own investment properties. There are people who only own one residence, okay, who are in a different class position altogether. But then there are people who have mortgages. Okay, they really only own property in a deferred way, in an aspirational way. And then there are the people who are simply in debt, okay, and who have no collateral to back their debt. And that's a very dangerous situation, considering the general precarity of work. So it's also to kind of nuance our analysis of class in terms of insecure labor. This is important, but not sufficient, because to be on an insecure work contract and have housing collateral behind you is a very different thing to being on an insecure contract and have no asset-based wealth at all. What this means in terms of family is that we're moving back, one, to kind of dynastic economies, okay, where social chances are determined by your parents and your parents' wealth. And the flip side to that is economies of indentured labor, but which involve whole generations. An example of this, it's very stark in the United States, is the economy of student loans, where often grandparents and parents will go into debt to allow a child to go to college, okay, in the hopes that this child will land a job that is well paid enough to pay back that debt for multiple generations of the family. Okay. These are new forms of indenture. What is peculiar about them is these are not so much personal forms of indebtedness as intergenerational, familial forms of indebtedness. Something I would add that I explore in my new book is that we're also seeing the resurgence of outright familial forms of enterprise, familial forms of capitalist enterprise. It's obvious when you look at people like Donald Trump, Koch Industries, the Koch brothers. These private family enterprises have always existed, but they've acquired a new prominence and centrality in American capitalism that they did not have in the 1970s. Along with this, we've seen a rise of active private investment capital that often has a surprisingly patrimonial, familial organizational structure. So a whole lot of private equity and hedge funds in the last 10 years after the global financial crisis returned the money of their limited partners and reorganized as so-called family offices. This means they're only using their own money and the money of their extended family to invest. How is this possible? It's a symptom of the extreme wealth concentration that occurred after the financial crisis and thanks to quantitative easing. It's also a symptom of the fact that as hedge funds and private equity have become a little more regulated, family offices have emerged as the least regulated form of private investment capital. If you look at the big tech giants too, they may look like corporations and they may be listed, but if you look at their actual structures, they almost invariably deploy so-called dual-class share structures. So the massive shareholders does not have the same voting rights and hence control over this corporation as a small group of insiders who are often part of the same family. So you have these patrimonial dynastic structures that are surging up behind the facade of publicly listed shareholder democracy, if you like. So I think this return of the family as a vector of wealth transmission is happening at a number of different levels simultaneously.
Yo creo que hay una dificultad a la hora de analizar las propuestas económicas de las extremas derechas actualmente, bueno, porque responden a contextos locales, pero también porque se van moviendo de acuerdo a sus propios equilibrios internos, los equilibrios de los partidos, pero también a los contextos locales, ¿no? Lo digo porque podemos ver tanto propuestas anti-austeridad, por ejemplo, Melinda ha estudiado esto en un artículo que está en un recopilatorio que se llama Neoliberalismo mutante. Este sí está traducido, está publicado en lengua de trapo. Entonces, ella investiga cómo en la Europa postcrisis del 2008 parte de estas extremas derechas, ¿no? En concreto la Agrupación Nacional de Le Pen o la Liga Italiana, desafiaron la austeridad fiscal con teorías económicas heterodoxas y con propuestas antineoliberales, ¿no? Aunque también ella dice que tenían una lógica interna también diferente a las propuestas de las izquierdas en ese sentido, ¿no? Pero, evidentemente, desde aquí, desde el Estado español, vemos propuestas muy diferentes, ¿no? Como es la de Vox, que tiene un programa muy contradictorio porque su apuesta más fuerte, digamos, es por la privatización de la sanidad, de la educación, etcétera. También por una reducción radical de impuestos, ¿no? Un programa neoliberal bastante clásico. Por otro lado, si escogéis su programa electoral, propone todo tipo de ayudas, sobre todo en un sentido, pues, de estimular las tasas de natalidad, ¿no? De ayudas a las madres, etcétera, ¿no? Pero bueno, aparte de este ejemplo que tenemos aquí, vemos el extremo de Milei, ¿no? Que es un libertariano, se diría en castellano, libertario desde luego yo no le diría, en inglés es libertarian, ¿no? Que se entiende mejor, que tiene propuestas económicas todavía más extremas, ¿no? Entonces la pregunta es, ¿por qué se produce esta amplitud de programas, ¿no? Si responden a contextos diferentes o si estas extremas derechas tienen funciones diversas? Y también qué sucede con esta alianza entre conservadores y neoliberales hoy después de Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. There is a great diversity of economic positions on the far right. Some of it is strategic and opportunistic. Some of it is deeply felt. So I guess one good thing is that there is division on the far right, because sometimes it looks like there isn't. There was a moment after the European debt crisis, the Syriza kind of moment, and in the US it was the moment of the Bernie Sanders campaign, where it did look like there was a kind of national socialist far right, okay? An economic, how could you describe it? It's not leftist, but economic redistributive, welfarist far right that was on the ascendancy. Okay? Certainly you can see that in places like France, where the former National Front is kind of divided between a welfare chauvinist and a more kind of neoliberal current. I think Marine Le Pen is more of the welfare chauvinist, and other members of her family are more neoliberal. So I think that's important to keep in mind. At the moment, I think it's a strong intellectual current. I don't think it's a strong political current. My prediction is that it becomes a strong political current when the left looks strong. It's almost in a competitive relationship. In terms of intellectual sources, there's a US-based magazine called Compact Magazine, which represents this position now. Sometimes it's, referred to as kind of a red-brown alliance. And there are various people who used to be on the far left who now have kind of flipped to this position. And they flipped post-Bernie Sanders, which is interesting and alarming. And again, around the same kind of constellation of debates around gender, race, national borders, this kind of thing. So it certainly exists and is consolidating as an intellectual current. It doesn't look politically alive to me at the moment. It seems to me that what dominates the global far right now is this libertarian far right conglomerate that is very strong in the United States. It's referred to as paleo-libertarianism. It has elements of white supremacism. It's theocratic, openly theocratic. It's very much driving the radical anti-abortion movement. And Javier Milei is a student of this movement. Like, he hails Murray Rothbard, who was the star of American libertarianism, as one of his sources of inspiration. So this, to me, seems the most dominant current at the moment. But I certainly think there is a split on the far right. Perhaps that's good to know. And perhaps the left can in some way work with that split. At the moment, it looks like they're better at working with splits on the left. But anyway, there is some hope there, I think.
Sorry, because I think it's very difficult.
What I'm saying?
No, my question.
Oh, the question.
Quería preguntarle si, actualmente el neoliberalismo parece abocado a una crisis de legitimidad y han emergido nuevos discursos que parecen cuestionar su hegemonía, ¿no? Pero también estas nuevas incógnitas relacionadas con la emergencia de las opciones de extrema derecha. Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿qué podría sustituir esta hegemonía neoliberal? Y si son los ultraderechistas del presente una alternativa efectiva a ese orden, o solo una fase autoritaria que pretende contener los malestares que provoca el propio sistema.
Yeah, that's very interesting because there is a crisis of legitimacy. Are the ultra-rightist of today an alternative? In a sense, the ultra-rightists that I just talked about belong to the lineage of neoliberalism. They're a kind of updating of the neoliberal, neoconservative alliance, but they push further to the extremes on both sides. So it becomes libertarianism and paleoconservatism. The funny thing about the American libertarians is they are an offshoot of the neoliberal economic tradition. They look to the Austrian neoliberals. So they're inspired by people like Ludwig von Mises and Hayek, who always thought that Milton Friedman and co were they call them socialists because Milton Friedman had no problems with the central bank. He wanted to use the central bank for monetarism. He did not want to entirely abolish the taxation system, and they do. They want to abolish the central bank, and they want to abolish taxation completely. What is odd about this element of this kind of extreme neoliberalism is that there's something in it that, if implemented, will undercut the whole basis of American hegemony. I mean, Javier Milei says he's going to abolish the Argentinian central bank. Possibly he will. But you cannot imagine American libertarians abolishing the Federal Reserve without completely destroying American capitalism. Okay? So I put that out there at the same time that I recognize these voices now have a real power within the Republican Party. So as bizarre as it sounds, this is not completely in the realm of impossibility. If you look at the debt ceiling crises and the debt ceiling debates that Americans have every couple of years when it comes to deciding on budgets, this is driven by the libertarian far right. So is this, in a sense, they're a continuation. They're taking neoliberalism to its extreme radical conclusion. But if implemented in practice, it would undermine the very basis of neoliberal economic power in the US. So it's a very odd kind of development. Okay, it's almost suicidal. Turning to the question of whether the left has an alternative to neoliberal hegemony, I think there's questions that need to be foregrounded much more directly. On the left, I think there hasn't yet been a comprehensive answer to the question of austerity and the organization of money. I'm not saying that there haven't been activist responses, but I think in a sense the left needs to have a vision of what a revolutionary politics of public money and public spending would be as a placeholder vision to oppose to the far right. Because I think because of the force of the right at this point in time, and because of the hegemony of neoliberal thinking, the power of left strategies of direct organizing and mutual aid is blunted. It's that can easily be read as an accommodation to neoliberal economic policy. Neoliberals too support mutual aid and self-sufficiency. As long as we are not proposing our own politics of money as alternative and pushing it back upon the state, we are posing no threat and we have no vision of what comes after. I mean, I guess it's that old idea that you can't move to the center in the face of the far right. You need a more radical vision, but I think a vision that is also constructive. So that's, I do see a lot of people coming to this set of questions on the left, arriving at this conclusion. I don't think there's any obvious answers yet. But the fact that so many people on the left have become interested in the question of public money creation, the most obvious symptom of this is modern monetary theory. I don't see that as the answer, but I see that set of questions as being absolutely central to the left. I think we need our own politics of money, collective debt creation, collective spending, at least as a horizon for what we're doing. And I think that kind of big horizon is the only way, really, of confronting the right. You need to go face to face with them, but you also need to go over, if that makes sense.
¿Me traduces? ¿O solo te explico?
Lo intento y si no, le...
Vale. No, simplemente de lo que has dicho, una puntualización, que es entender los espacios de apoyo mutuo como espacios de organización política donde se genera la fuerza que hará posible que se impongan nuestras visiones, digamos, de macroeconomía, o que no es solo un lugar de alternativa, sino un lugar de construir fuerza social para hacer posible esas visiones, digamos, sobre lo que tiene que hacer el Estado o sobre qué tiene que ser el Estado. Bueno, esa es como lo vemos aquí, digamos, como nuestra visión para debatirse. To create
another institutional order or another maybe...
It's not an experimentation, it's like to...
Laboratory.
No, it's to build the strength in order to impose
It's true.
or bigger...
Excuse me.
Are you okay?
Yeah. It's absolutely true. I don't want to be misread as downplaying mutual aid. I think it's necessary, but not sufficient. I just see, I guess, a kind of a lot of embarrassment around the issue of public spending on the left and public institutions, welfare, social expenditures. And I think we need a way of understanding what our politics of public money would be in order to sharpen the mind, to have a sense of where we're going in terms of mutual aid and our organizing.
Pues yo seguiría preguntando, pero creo que voy a abrir el turno de preguntas, ¿no? Porque are you feeling well?
I'm okay now.
Yeah.
I have a frog in my throat.
¿Que ¿Hago una última o abro el turno de palabras? ¿Qué opináis? ¿O demasiada democracia? ¿Hago lo que quiero o qué? Hago la última, ¿vale? Porque para mí es un lujo contar con Melinda. The last one. Sorry. Hoy estamos asistiendo como a una explotación, digamos, de las ansiedades reproductivas que utilizan las extremas derechas, ¿no? Todo este marco del invierno demográfico, de la teoría del gran reemplazo. No os lo voy a explicar, pero bueno, me imagino que a todos os suena, ¿no?, esta idea de que las tasas de fecundidad son muy bajas y que por tanto hay que estimular el nacimiento de hijos nacionales, etcétera, ¿no? bueno, pues estas extremas derechas vinculan estos miedos al rechazo a la inmigración, a la idea de la nación en peligro, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, mi pregunta es, ¿qué consecuencias tiene para las mujeres o para las personas que se consideran no reproductivas, ¿no? En este caso las disidencias sexuales? ¿Y qué discursos y políticas se están pensando bajo esta óptica y cómo podemos contrarrestarlos?
Yeah, it's always a trap for feminists because it seems like the only moment and the only conditions under which the centre, political centre, will consider subsidising childcare is when there's some kind of demographic anxiety. And it's remarkable to me now that so many radical neoliberals, even in the US, are talking about childcare policies and support for families, people who are, hate the welfare state like it's the devil, and yet this is the one area where they'll take a step back. The consequences for women and the non-reproductive, the sterile and the nation killers, is, often limits on abortion. So that much we've seen. And I think there's an interesting temporality here that places like the US can learn so much from Poland and Latin America, from the feminist struggles that have taken place there. I'm not sure how much more detail I can give
No,
you.
it's okay. Also, I was thinking, estaba pensando en lo primero es,
I can, yes.
estaba pensando en las políticas que se están haciendo en Ucrania que pretenden estimular la natalidad y que, por ejemplo, son, digamos, ayudas del estado de bienestar que tienen implícita una moralidad, ¿no? Entonces, a través, por ejemplo, de una cosa que se llaman préstamos preferentes a parejas, pero que el objetivo es que tengan hijos. Entonces, a medida que van teniendo más hijos, el interés baja, ¿no?, de esos préstamos. O además solo se dan a una pareja donde sea el primer matrimonio de las dos personas que lo contraen, etcétera, ¿no? Como son políticas destinadas a moralizar la sociedad, ¿no? Y supeditan, digamos, el estado del bienestar a eso. Do you want to translate this?
She's talking about policies in Ukraine that are directed for increasing the birth rate, and they depend on a kind of welfare morality because they give the loans, the preferent loans,
Yes.
the policy for couples who want to have children,
Yeah.
and depending on that they give more or less loans
Yeah.
to that couple.
Yeah.
What do you think?
And they have less interest if you have more children. The more
Oh.
children you have, the less interest you have to pay.
Oh, okay.
It's
Yeah,
kind
I
of,
think, I mean, a lot of countries have this. Australia has just like an outright baby bonus. The more babies you make, the more money you get. And this came from the Liberal Party, which is the Conservative party. It's kind of outrageously generous. And yeah, it's an outright nativist, nationalist policy. It goes together. I mean, they're pragmatic. They will also encourage migration, but I think there's a preference. As you move to the right, there is a preference for racially exclusive, high-quality reproduction, and they will be quite explicit. And demographic discourses that look very old are popping up everywhere now. There's some kind of surprise about the great replacement theories, but if you look at the detail of policy in many countries that do not look like they've tracked to the far right, countries like France and Australia, you see the same logic at work, basically subsidizing natality, and in certain kind of selective ways.
Gracias. Thank you. Si queréis abrimos el turno de palabras, hay un micrófono, entonces podéis levantar la mano y os pasamos el micro. Y si no, tengo más preguntas, pero creo que está cansada, porque no se encuentra muy bien hoy.
Si queréis decirla en castellano o en inglés, si no yo intento traducir al inglés.
¿Ya? Justo antes de la última pregunta se ha quedado en el aire como que la izquierda debería de afinar sobre el gasto público, ¿no? Que si podía profundizar un poco más sobre las ideas, o sea, sobre el problema que tiene la izquierda a la hora de afrontar el debate del gasto público. ¿Qué opinión tiene? Se ha quedado por encima, ¿no? Y luego también me parece también importante la opinión de la izquierda o el debate de la izquierda en cuanto al ingreso público, cómo ingresar, ¿no? Para gastar. El debate creo que si solo lo tomamos por el lado del gasto se queda incompleto. Entonces creo que hay serios problemas en la izquierda a la hora de afrontar este debate y bueno, para saber su opinión.
A lot of interest in the Anglo-American left at the moment, including from people who are left economists, about what would like a revolutionary public finance look like. It's a question that's kind of forgotten. There isn't much of a historiography. But it seems like our imaginary hasn't quite encompassed the question of central bank money creation, collective debt issuance, and public spending in a way that it would see it as an issue for the left and for the left to experiment with. It's almost like our view of revolution is stuck in a kind of 19th century pre-social state. So pre-mass public deficit creation, pre-collective wealth redistribution. So I think there are people who are trying to think, what would it mean, one, to critique public finance from the far left, to look at everything from public spending decisions to taxation. What would it mean to manage money without defending private wealth, without having an institution of private wealth? I guess the wager is that you can separate the institution of money and debt creation from the defense of private wealth. That a revolutionary public finance would be about collective debt creation for collective services, wages, okay? Without having to waste so much money on defending private property and wealth, which is basically, what austerity is all about.
¿Más preguntas? ¿No? ¿Queréis iros a casa? ¿Tan pronto? Pues, si no hay más preguntas, voy a cerrar aquí. O voy a hacer yo otra, que ya veis que me gusta mucho, ¿no? No. Pues una que me he dejado antes, para daros la oportunidad de preguntar. Is number 10? I'm going to come back to reality. Un poco en su trabajo también ha explicado, dices que los movimientos antinormativos y antifamiliares que surgieron en los años 70 también estuvieron relacionados, es algo que ha comentado antes también en la primera pregunta, ¿no? Estaban relacionados con estados del bienestar más generosos y precios de la vivienda más accesibles, ¿no? Eso hacía posible experimentar pues, también otras formas de vida y quizá tener como más espacio, digamos, para la militancia, ¿no? Para el activismo. Entonces, quería que explicases qué consecuencias tiene este modelo de bienestar basado en activos, ¿no? Lo que decíamos que se depende más de la herencia o de las propiedades o de las inversiones que en el estado del bienestar efectivo, ¿no? De lo que provee el Estado, ¿no? Cómo este bienestar basado en activos condiciona la vida de los jóvenes y cómo afecta las posibilidades de experimentar otras formas de vida no normativas o cómo dificulta el activismo o las vidas dedicadas a la militancia.
Yeah, I think it does.
This is activism.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
bad translation.
I think it does have a real effect on cities. You can see when there's kind of massive property price inflation, cities die. So, you know, San Francisco died, Sydney died. There's so many cities have died. Berlin apparently is not doing so well. It just puts a dampener on social creativity because there's a loss of free time, free energy. There's a loss of wasted time. Somehow need a lot of wasted time for creative solidarity and experimenting with new ways of life. So I think it really does create a dampener, but perhaps I never want to be completely nostalgic because it doesn't really lead anywhere. But perhaps this being pushed back into homes, being pushed back into the family home or out onto the edges of the city, being pushed online, I guess, is one kind of last form of exit, offers different opportunities. I think one kind of escape route I see there is the fact that we seem to have arrived at a situation. I'm talking about my own experience here, so it may not be as dramatically bad here. But we seem to have arrived at a situation in the cities of Australia where there just is no aspiration anymore. So I think that whole phenomenon, the great dropout of work that occurred during COVID, supposedly, reflects that. People are just not even giving it a try anymore. It's not even worth the hassle. That kind of retreating back to your parents' home, living in the shed, in the backyard, is itself a kind of dropping out, and if not kind of leisure and luxury, sometimes it just ends up being free time in a different space. I also think there's intergenerational opportunities sometimes. There are older people that become or have become politicized by the situation they found themselves in, and there are kind of like new forms of elderly poverty that are quite extreme. So I think there is kind of a meeting of different generations around that. So in Sydney, there are older people who don't own property. That's often older women, but not only. It's also divorced women. They're living in cars, living around parks. They're kind of living in semi-communal spaces. I do not want to romanticize this. But connecting with people, so young, homeless people that they would not have connected with before. And I think this challenges the model of social movement that came out of the 70s was a social artifact of that time. It's a time when young people had the money to move out of home, to go to university, and the whole kind of impulse behind 1968, the Black Power movement, feminism, was these people in their early 20s who suddenly had free time and free money outside of the bounds, the immediate imperatives of work and family, to experiment. But that is also a kind of trap for our imagination, always think the young are the radical. I think there are kind of experiences of extreme and sudden late life poverty that are creating new kind of old age radicalism. You see that in, I don't know if that is happening here, but some of the most, some of the bravest direct action around the environment and mining in Australia comes from people in their 60s and above. This has become really heavily policed, like, you know, straight to jail. But the people who seem to be leading these movements are older. So I don't think there's ever any complete closure to escape. I just think we're at a kind of transitional moment, at least from the context I'm speaking in. Spain seems to have a different temporality, and you've seen moments of really exciting activism.
Very good. Pues nada, quería daros las gracias por estar aquí, darle las gracias a Melinda Cooper. Y recordar también que el curso de la familia todavía está abierto por si os queréis inscribir. Va a ser muy interesante, vamos a discutir todas estas cosas y algunas más. Y nada, bueno, muchas gracias por haber venido y gracias a la gente que nos está escuchando por streaming.